Well, good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. Let me first of all state that I'm going to restrict my talk to bacteria. I won't discuss viruses, even though they may lead to VAP infections, and I'm not going to discuss fungi either. I'm going to discuss only bacteria. This is my conflict of interest, and I'd also like to pay tribute to a number of people who made me laugh for about 40 years. Let me first state what the issue is, the problem. What is the point of these rapid tests, and why do we carry them out? I've looked at three possible reasons. Obviously, I'm summarizing matters and simplifying them, and therefore it cannot be all true. But the first interesting aspect is individual. The idea is to bring in as quickly as possible the most appropriate antibiotherapy. This is what we were taught, and this is probably what we need to do. The second point is collective. And the collective point is to reduce volume as much as possible and as quickly as possible, and that is where the tests can also be very helpful. And then we have randomized tests supported by industry assessing new antibiotics. Unfortunately, there aren't that many, but it does exist. On a molecule, for instance, that's going to be active on carbapenemase, on ESLB, introducing 80% of highly sensitive patients is not perhaps the point. So it's interesting both from the individual point of view, that's to say for the patient, but also from the collective point of view for commercialization of the molecule. Now, immediate advantage has been demonstrated by a number of studies. I've chosen this one. The authors have looked at the difference between association and monotherapy. They've demonstrated that association or appropriate monotherapy, you can't much tell the difference, both lines are in fact the same, is better than a single inappropriate therapy. Now, you also have an institutional demand, an international requirement. As I've given a few examples, I've got the Peterson example, and the FDA is encouraged to work closely to set up techniques for Staphylococcus MRSA in diagnosis of RTI. You also have recently the recommendations of the Commission working closely with the White House, where goal number 3, there are several goals, but goal number 3 is the use of rapid and innovative tests, particularly for the identification and characterization of resistant bacteria. And even more recently, in December 2014, the World Health Organization and the Executive Committee wrote, we need to be able to have effective, rapid, and cost-effective diagnosis tools that can be easily integrated into clinical practice, which all sounds quite nice, but what is it that we are talking about? Well, it's a blending of a variety of things, which is why it's complicated. You have, for instance, gram-stain and direct antibiogram, which is a rapid technique, and you have a number of tests that are genotypic tests, for instance, PCR, that are increasingly sophisticated and make it possible to detect bacteria, and even more interesting, to detect resistance. You also have a number of tests that are phenotypic. On the left, if the mouse responds, no, the mouse is not responding. Anyway, on the left, you have biochemical tests to detect ESBL, carbapenemase, MRSA, and you have mass spectrometry. So the tests at the top are useful for initial treatment, and the tests at the bottom of the slide are useful perhaps to modify the treatment. You can also bring in an association between these tests. Anyway, so what are we looking for? What are we requesting? Well, everything, really. We're always tempted to ask for as much as we can get. We trust microbiologists, but what can we really get? Now, rapid tests in a perfect world are something of a dream. What are you requesting from these tests? You want them to have sensibility and specificity as close as possible to 100%, PPV and PV at 100. You want a clear-cut response, it's either yes or no. You want a rapid result. What's a rapid result, by the way? Less than 2 hours would be nice. If you want to modify the initial antibiotic therapy, you want them available 24/7, including on Christmas Day. You want to detect resistance, you want to distinguish between colonization and infection, and you want it to be cost-effective. Now, it does sound like a dream, doesn't it? Now, this is a very interesting paper by Andrew Shaw, demonstrating for detection of Staphylococcus aureus in RTI that the predictive positive or negative value, and I'm sorry the cursor is no longer functioning, but will depend on sensibility, specificity, but also prevalence of a disease. It's not always true for the predictive negative test. It's a little bit more true for positive, which is here in black. If you have a test with sensibility, sensitivity, and specificity of 79%, well, you still need a certain prevalence of the disease. Otherwise, you do not have a good positive predictive value, but you still get a good negative predictive value. Now, what is easily available, or could be, it doesn't mean that it's the case everywhere. You have direct examination, you have a direct antibiogram, then you have PCR for Staphylococcus aureus and other bacteria, but not VAP. You have mass spectrometry, and including as well, increasingly, biochemical tests. Another direct examination. This is not my slide, but let's go back to what we know: culture, preliminary report, susceptibility report after 48 hours, sometimes a bit more, even up to 72 hours. Then you have direct examination, a gram or direct antibiogram, final culture, and you gain a lot of time with PCR. Now, there are limitations. It's not always available everywhere. Contrary to what you might think, you need experienced and competent staff for a gram. It's not that fast. There are traps, Coccobacillus, for instance. You don't know whether it's Staphylococcus aureus or something else. Correlation with culture is not always obvious, and there can be also a negative direct examination and positive culture if the inoculum is low. We have, of course, meta-analysis. There's meta-analysis for everything nowadays, and this is one on the gram stain, and you can see that out of 21 studies, not bad. It gives both a sensibility and specificity that's not that bad, but it's far from perfect. Then the direct antibiogram, low cost, relatively, and quite useful, developed several years ago now by Spanish teams. You can gain 24 hours on a colony. And you have here on the left, you use several test strips. On the left, you have monomicrobial cultures. Then you have biomicrobial cultures with Staphylococcus aureus, Colibacillus, and sometimes even a third. Test of 6 antibiotics, all listed here. And you can see the total agreement, TA, as compared to the normal antibiogram, and it's quite good because it's above 90, sometimes 95. It's not 100%, but it's quite good. So the next question is, what is all this for? From the clinical point of view, well, not much is available. The same team, Emilio Boisin, Patricia Munoz from Spain, have compared a certain number of outcomes by using this technique, e-test, and a control group. So we don't have a before and after comparison, but it's quite good. There's quite a number of patients, and the results are quite interesting. The e-test technique enabled a high percentage of patients undergoing appropriate antibiotic therapy faster if you look at the figures. So there is an impact, which does present certain advantages. Our friends in Bordeaux, several years later, a couple of years ago, carried out a similar study, and you can see that with about the same antibiotics, we have total agreements of about 90%, but not 100%. And then recently, in Hôpital Bichat, with Mathieu Ledors and Laurent Serment-Lefebvre, we also set up another technique associated with MALDI-TOF for a direct antibiogram with a direct reading after intubation of 18 to 24 hours with a dilution depending on the number of bacteria that are visible by direct examination. And this technique that is not based on the strips has the advantage of testing a lot more antibiotics. You saw that in the previous test we were talking about 5 or 6. With this one, we're up to 16. So we had 85 BALs with BGN, direct examination, 76 patients with a suspicion of VAP, monomicrobial mainly. You have the list here of all the antibiotics that were tested in this study. And if you look at both columns on the on the right, which are the PPV and NPV, to predict resistance positively and sensibility with the negative, the important point here is probably the last column, because if it's sensitive, if you answer that it's sensitive, whether it's resistance, probably more important than the other way around. So you see that the agreement with the classical antibiogram is about 100%. There's no real impact studies. It's somewhat theoretical with a potential impact. If in real life, this was an assessment, if in real life we had used this, we could have had a modification mainly on carbapenems with decrease in 30% of cases, and if you add 10% change for inadequate treatment, you would still reach about over 40% of patients for which this technique could make a difference. Obviously, we would need a broader study to confirm this. Now, PCR, I think that in terms of VAPs, we're only talking about Staphylococcus aureus. You have several studies, particularly this one, using the SFM test, which is one of the best. Whether you're talking about quantitative, qualitative studies, you have negative predictive value, which is quite good. And if you check the consistency compared to standard culture, you have, for instance, in quantitative, you have Staphylococcus aureus, you have 43, and then you have 0 Staphylococcus aureus. So this was quite a good study. Another that went a little further and looked at the possible impact is a study in Marseille by Marc Léon. Routine use of, well, this test for patients with suspected VAP. And you can see that PPV is not very good. NPV is quite good, and this is about 1 hour after BL, and there was a bit of a study in terms of co-efficacy when antibiotic therapy of at least 3 days cost 50 euros a day. Well, it's useful, whatever the prevalence of Staphylococcus aureus. If you're using antibiotics of 50 euros a day, in order to have a minimum of cost effectiveness, you need a prevalence of 20%, which is not, I believe, what we observe today in France. So you can also look at other correlations, such as nasal swabs, and you also get very interesting results. What is increasingly used is mass spectrometry with bacterial identification. This is a slide I've taken from Laurence. You have an unknown microorganism. You take a colony, you get a biochemical profile, amino acid, you compare to a database, and you have identification that's immediate as soon as you have your culture. So, again, what's the point? Does it make any difference? I have found no data, possibly I've missed it, but I found no data that is specific to a VAP. There's quite a few papers on septicemia or candidemia, but I think the more recent is a before-after study with all limitations that that entails, with a drop of mortality. I'm a bit surprised, in fact, at this result, but there you go. There's also a drop in the time spent in ICU. Well, that's very nice. And something perhaps a bit more credible, drop in the delays for effectiveness of antibiotic therapy. So it's multi-tough. It's not a result on the same day. So I'm a bit surprised at the result, but possibly you can speed things up. Then you have this paper combining the association between MALDI-TOF and PCR for Staphylococcus aureus. You have on the left, I've got my cursor again, and then you have the control here. And then, Commission Misalide, you have in the intervention group, you can see that there is less treatment given for MATS than for the control group, plus a gain of time. Biochemical tests are the final point. I'm going to go very briefly on this because, as far as I know, there is no analysis whatsoever as to their impacts. The only thing we have is this, that we are using in Bichat, in microbiology lab, to predict MATR Staphylococcus aureus, to look at the presence of PLP2A on a colony, on a positive hemoculture. It's a strip, and I think that it is, in fact, quite easy. And you've certainly seen the work of Patrice Nordman on tests to detect carbophenamases. You also have others to detect ESLB and other hospitals. I believe yours in particular, Jean-Yves, the possibility of responding quite quickly if the hemoculture is related ESLB. Finally, something else that is either under development or about to develop. This is the future, which I won't presume to predict, but you have genotypic tests with real-time multiplex PCR. And also you have spectrometry to detect resistance. This is a paper on VAP with multiplex PCR, 13 pathogens, 24 resistance factors, 4 to 6 hours for results. This is not routine, it is expensive, quite clearly. Now, this is not a slide that's been designed to be read from a distance, but I've borrowed it to say that in the future, in the world of the future, we can hope that with PCR, with the patient with pneumonia or suspected pneumonia, we may have available, but again, this is a complete dream, a molecular target, and according to the molecular target, to find out same afternoon what antibiotic can be used. So this is one before last. MALDI-TOF can be used to detect resistance. I suspect you can't tell the difference from a distance. It's difficult to even close up, but we trust our microbiologist colleagues. You have increasing number of papers that demonstrate that it's possible to detect resistance here. High-speed sequencing. So, to summarize, genotypic and phenotypic tests to assist antibiotic therapy. Well, genotypic, well, yes, we've got mainly GNB for Staphylococcus aureus. Phenotypic is already documented. Integration into the workflow is difficult for genotypic. It's easy for MALDI-TOF. Cost effectiveness, we have hardly any data on genotypic. The MALDI-TOF is very expensive, but it's quite immediately interesting. Clinical evaluation is limited in both cases, as you can see. Detection of resistance, yes, for genotypic and for Staphylococcus aureus mainly, and we haven't reached that point for gram-negative and phenotypic. We're not sure yet. In terms of conclusions, phenotypic test is probably the best compromise available between the workload in the lab and service to the patient. The extraordinary revolution is mass spectrometry, I believe, even though the consequences can still be discussed. Direct antibiogram should not be neglected, and biochemical methods for detection of resistance could be assessed. Genotypic is early detection of resistance. It's limited to MRSA for VAPs. And what we're expecting, but it might be difficult, is resistance resistance in NGBs, but for the moment it's a dream. Well, good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me. Let me first of all state that I'm going to restrict my talk to bacteria. I won't discuss viruses, even though they may lead to VAP infections, and I'm not going to discuss fungi either. I'm going to discuss only bacteria. This is my conflict of interest. And I'd also like to pay tribute to a number of people who made me laugh for about 40 years. Let me first state what the issue is, the problem. What is the point of these rapid tests, and why do we carry them out? I've looked at three possible reasons. Obviously, I'm summarizing matters and simplifying them, and therefore it cannot be all true. But the first interesting aspect is individual. The idea is to bring in as quickly as possible the most appropriate antibiotherapy. This is what we were taught, and this is probably what we need to do. The second point is collective. And the collective point is to reduce volume as much as possible and as quickly as possible, and that is where the tests can also be very helpful. And then we have randomized tests supported by industry assessing new antibiotics. Unfortunately, there aren't that many, but it does exist. On a molecule, for instance, that's going to be active on carbapenemase, on ESLB, introducing 80% of highly sensitive patients is not perhaps the point. So it's interesting both from the individual point of view, that's to say for the patient, but also from the collective point of view for commercialization of the molecule. Now, immediate advantage has been demonstrated by a number of studies. I've chosen this one. The authors have looked at the difference between association and monotherapy. They've demonstrated that association or appropriate monotherapy, you can't much tell the difference, both lines are in fact the same, is better than a single inappropriate therapy. Now, you also have an institutional demand, an international requirement. As I've given a few examples, I've got the Peterson example, and the FDA is encouraged to work closely to set up techniques for Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, in diagnosis of RTI. You also have recently the recommendations of the Commission working closely with the White House, where goal number 3, there are several goals, but goal number 3 is the use of rapid and innovative tests, particularly for the identification and characterization of resistant bacteria. And even more recently, in December 2014, the World Health Organization and the Executive Committee wrote, we need to be able to have effective, rapid, and cost-effective diagnosis tools that can be easily integrated into clinical practice, which all sounds quite nice, but what is it that we are talking about? Well, it's a blending of a variety of things, which is why it's complicated. You have, for instance, Gram-stain and director antibiogram, which is a rapid technique, and you have a number of tests that are